We've been overpromised here.
Never.
Any particular reason for they're gracing us this evening more so than any other meetings? Like,
To
is there?
listen to the community engagement discussion so that they
Gotcha.
can hear what you found, because I felt like hearing it firsthand and hearing your discussion would be valuable for them.
Yeah.
All set, Herb.
All right. All right. It's, I think, 6:32, and I'll call the meeting to order. And ask Dick if he would mind reading the norms.
Are we going to
I'm
public
sorry.
comment?
I'm sorry. Do we have any public?
Lexi is having trouble getting in, but she's trying.
Okay.
She's not technically public.
True.
Celeste, are you letting the other people in that are in the waiting room?
Yes, I'm letting him in right now.
I see that.
I'll
Okay.
wait a minute to see whether some of them may have some comment. Let me know when they're all in.
Ben Freeman just arrived.
Celeste, is anybody still in the waiting room?
No.
Okay. So I don't know. There was a number.
They're
of-
all principals.
They're all principals. Okay. Well, they are public if they would. I suppose if they want to comment now, they certainly can.
Aaron is not principal. He's a writer, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So at the beginning, we have our normal 10-minute public comment time. That's not to say that if you have a comment later on, you'll be ignored necessarily, but this is a guaranteed time when you can comment. Does anybody have any comments? And if you're not on video, you're going to have to use, I think, the hand gesture or a thumbs up or something, or just speak up. I don't see anybody attempting to comment. So
Norms.
get to read the norms.
Ready? We will make sure all our students are our first priority. We will honor the distinction between governance and administrative responsibilities. We will set ends policies, executive limitations policies, board management delegation policies, and governance policies, and measure our performance against these policies. We will set goals for our work that are SMART: specific, measurable, attainable, results-oriented, and time-bound, and we will periodically check in on these goals. We will conduct ourselves in a courteous and professional manner. This means we will respect time, follow protocol, speak to the point, be prepared, bring closure to open items. We will make fact-based decisions that are in the best interests of our stakeholders. We will clearly and effectively communicate with all stakeholders.
Thank you, Dick. At this stage, does anybody have any comments about whether we are following our norms?
I think we are.
Very good. All right, the next item is the consent agenda, and again,
I
that's
move the consent agenda.
Thank you. A move by Dick. Is there a second on the consent agenda? Seconded by Mel. Okay. Remember, if you want something off the consent agenda, it takes a vote to get it off. This would be the point at which to say that you want it off the consent agenda. I don't see anybody saying that. Jane.
Let me see, am I on here? Okay, good. So I know that I had emailed you, Herb. I just as a point of clarification with respect to policy governance.
Okay, well, we're still on the consent agenda.
Correct.
Yeah.
I guess I'm concerned about where we have all the information about community engagement.
That's, I think, item 8 on the agenda.
Right. So for instance, help me out here as far as maybe where I need to be voicing this concern. That, as I had mentioned in my email to you, I don't recall in our minutes there being any board decision to actually go forth with reviewing doing this analysis that we're planning to do this evening?
I think the most appropriate place for that would be item 8, but if somebody would like to
Okay,
change the order of the agenda, that would be all right.
I believe that the communications committee has communicated a bunch of times and outlined in the work plan a process.
Excuse me, Dick, could we just stick to whether we want to take up that item now or whether it belongs under number 8?
Okay.
In the order it's printed.
Under 8.
Okay. Any other questions or reservations about the consent agenda, which is simply last time's minutes and hiring, which does have some new people at the end of the board packet, not the end of the public packet. All right, we have a motion. It was made by Dick. It was seconded by Mel. Any discussion on that motion? No. Okay. All those in favor of passing the consent agenda, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed, please raise your hand. Anybody abstaining, please raise your hand. Appears to pass unanimously then. Thank you. All right, under executive limitations, the first thing is an approval of the superintendent's interpretation of policy 2.6. And I believe what Randy did was put in red all the changes from what we saw last time. Is that right, Randy?
That is correct. And there were, I apologize. There were a number of interesting, I don't know why those items just dropped off, because in the document itself, they were complete, but for whatever reason, when it printed for you last time, it didn't print everything. So I tried to go through and highlight all the places in which I thought it had been dropped off. So I believe I've caught all of them. So yeah, all the red is the adjustments based on my review from the last meeting.
I move that we.
Okay, Dick has a motion, yeah?
I move that we approve the interpretation as presented.
Okay, moved by Dick. Is there a second? Seconded by Mel. Okay, discussion. And this would involve both the new and conceivably the old items, if there's something in one of the old items that now causes somebody to wonder about a question. I have one. I hate to be the one that brings these things up, but on packet page 10, under 2.6, the compliance item says compliance will be demonstrated when business manager asserts insurance renewal to superintendent once provided and then received. I don't know what that means.
So once we receive the insurance renewal, so she's going to assert the renewal itself once we get it. And that,
how do you assert a renewal?
Sue, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, what is it that we were?
In my mind, I'm asserting that it has been renewed. So in other words, our insurance is renewed on an annual basis, and we receive our renewal documents, our policy documents that contain all of the information, along with the deductibles and what we're covered for and all of that information. So that comes to us on an annual basis. So I would basically assert to Randy that we've received the renewals that are in line with the policy.
Might it be more appropriate to, instead of assert, to say announces or something like that?
I think we've used assert throughout our policy monitoring documents. I think Jackie started using that word. I think it's also been used in other documents. So I think we're sort of taking the lead from other documents that have been produced. It's basically me saying that we've gotten what we need. But I'm, in my role, asserting that we actually did.
Okay.
I think it's typical.
I think maybe I'm being old fashioned, but I think it should be asserts that insurance has been renewed or something like that.
Sure.
Dick,
I think the word assert is appropriate because if the board ever doubted that, then we could ask for the document itself.
And that's actually your evidence.
Right. Anybody else have a comment on anything on, let's do it page by page.
That's Jeff.
Jeff. Huh?
Jeff.
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to do it page by page or not? I'm just,
Well, I'm thinking maybe we should do page by page.
okay, then I'll wait. I'm right at the end.
Back at page 10, anything there? Don't see anybody. Back at page 11. I don't see anybody, but if you have a comment, just pipe up. Back at page 12.
Lee has a comment.
Lee?
It's under the number 5, compliance will be demonstrated when, again, I'm not sure, this is not just a wording thing, but district local procedure for written standards of conduct, blah, blah, blah. It should, I'm thinking district has a local procedure, district enforces local procedure, district complies with, you know.
Right, it's missing a verb.
You're demonstrating compliance by just district local procedure. That,
I think there's one word missing there. I think Lee's
yeah,
right.
I think that's just a wording thing.
Could we add one so that as long as it's okay with Dick and Mel when we vote, it will have the added word?
Yes.
That's
Uh,
okay.
Yeah, I'll read it. I hear what you're saying. I just need to review it for a minute and figure out where it fits most appropriately.
Would it make sense to change the word requiring to requires?
Yeah, that's probably exactly what I'm looking for, I think.
I think too, if you move the requires up front, so the district local procedure requires for written standards of conduct covering conflict of interest.
No, that's not English.
I think Mel's solution is requires, satisfies,
Yeah.
and clarifies. And I would be willing to accept that.
So it just, instead of requiring annual certification, it says requires an annual certification, right?
Yep, I've got it.
And I think the same thing happened down on 6, compliance number 4. I think there's a verb missing there too.
Yeah, it's the same. It's exactly the same issue. It's so funny. It's how I was reading it and writing it when we were working on it. But I hear what you're saying.
I accept that change as well.
And then the other one that I had was number 4 under 5 there. And this is just my newbie stuff here. It says superintendent has investigated any possible conflict of interest that arises, but it doesn't say that the superintendent has taken any action if needed. And I think that compliance requires action to me, but I'm not, I will defer to the rest of the board if that's not the way this normally gets done.
What happens if the superintendent investigated it and it requires, in her opinion, no action?
Then maybe the superintendent has investigated any possible conflict of interest and taken appropriate action.
How about that, Dick?
Fine.
Okay with you too, Mel?
Mm.
Do we, all right, let's go with the last page and then see if we have any, whoops, we have 2 last pages. Okay, back at page 13, any comments there? Don't see any. And page 14, is that where, Jeff, you read something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just, the number 2 under evidence, I just don't, and maybe it's me, is reading that, I just don't understand that sentence. Should the
Well,
super-
this came, right. So this is good conversation. This is directly from the last meeting. And the feedback that you as a board provided me saying that a superintendent may not intentionally take steps, but might unintentionally take steps. And so it was a response to the feedback that you had provided me about what to include in this interpretation.
Okay, but just
So-
reading that sentence, it says, should the superintendent engage in practices that endanger the district reputation, comma, they have taken immediate steps to address them and communicated with the board.
Right.
I think what happened there
Who's they?
is. I
Oh, so
think-
I was using, so I was
I think that the way this is drafted, they refers to the superintendent. Am I right?
correct. It's just
Ah.
gender neutral language that
Okay.
we're including.
But I found that a little confusing too. Maybe we could actually just repeat the superintendent there.
Yeah.
Sure, happy to make that change.
And should it-
Accept that change.
So the superintendent have taken or shall take?
I'll correct the grammar around the change.
Okay, I just want to make it clear
Yeah.
that other people read it, you know.
I accept both changes.
Thank you. And Mel, are they okay with you? Okay. All right. Anything else on the superintendent's interpretation before we vote to approve it? Looking around, I don't see any hands. All right. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Anybody opposing, please raise your hand. Anybody abstaining, please raise your hand. That passes unanimously then. And the next item would be the monthly update. And as usual, Randy, is there anything that you particularly want to call our attention to?
There's nothing specific that I would add to this. I've tried to keep you all fairly updated on things that have been going on, so I feel like you're updated on what's been happening recently. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have related to the update or any other communication you received recently from me.
Okay, if you have a question, could you please raise your hand?
I do actually have one thing that I can add that is not in any communication or in my report, but I spent some time in this discussing the concept of recovery planning, and this is, as I mentioned, pretty actively underway. And we have decided that the recovery team has changed the name, which I think is relevant and important for you to know. So we really were struggling with this concept of recovery planning, which I shared in the document itself, because it's a pretty loaded term from our perspective, and we felt like it was a deficit-minded approach that we didn't want to drive our work moving forward. So, as you know, we've been focusing this year on relationship, safety, and trust as guiding principles for our work. And so, in concert with that, the team that's been working on our planning this week adopted a new phrase, and we'll continue to use this moving forward. And it is going to be our reset education plan. And reset is an acronym for relationships, equity, safety, engagement, and trust. So those 5 principles will be guiding our planning through the summer and through next school year. And we felt like that was much more aligned with our values and how we wanted to approach the work moving forward. So I did want to update you on that. The team that's doing the work right now, we are hopefully finishing up our needs assessment by the end of this week. It's been a very, very positive and engaging process. And Skylar, who's on this call, has done a very, very good job of facilitating that work with the team. And the people that we have involved are taking it very seriously and analyzing our information well, and it's feeling actually pretty exciting to look ahead. So that's what I would add to what you have in front of you that you haven't already heard.
Okay, comments or questions? Jane.
So with respect to the reset, I know that you had mentioned in the report that they're going to be exploring how they might use those funds that are available. Have there been any other thoughts about that?
No, because there's stages to the planning. So right now we're identifying the needs assessment, and then following needs assessment between April 15th and May 15th, then we start looking at what the planning is. So, so as the plan is developed based on what our needs are, some of the investments will be coming clearer for us. We are looking at some system-wide sort of infrastructure things outside of the recovery planning. But what you will start seeing, if it's ready before I submit my report next month, you'll start seeing some details emerging in the plan. We just don't have that yet. So some of that will be investment. I want to be pretty transparent with you as a board and with our community about how we're spending those funds and how they align with our priorities and the work that moving ahead. So you'll start seeing it in my report once we have the information.
Other questions or comments? Dave?
I was just wondering if you could give us an update on the progress being made in getting teachers vaccinated, since that was a big deal of ours 2 months ago.
Sure. So I can't ask officially where we are. But what I did do was the Agency of Ed was wanting to make sure that teachers across the state and educators were being vaccinated and that people were not having challenges with receiving the vaccination. So, so they had sent out an email to me essentially saying, hey, do you have people who aren't able to be vaccinated? If so, we want to know, because we want to make sure we're setting up clinics where we should be across the state. There was one person in our system who had a delay. She had done one at a pharmacy. There was something. She needed a second vaccine, and that was the only person. And then the state had already put a clinic in place, and I forwarded that to all of our employees. And she emailed back and said, "Thank you for sending this. I was able to get an earlier appointment." So with the information I have, everybody who wants one, it either has it or is in process, but I don't know what our percentage is. Statewide, people who work in school districts are about 80%. About 80% of people are vaccinated. I am aware that we have some people who weren't quick to jump on getting the vaccine for personal reasons. Some of them were health related or just personal reasons, but I think most of our people did receive it.
Other comments or questions? Following up on David's, I wonder, oh no, go ahead, John, first.
I think you covered this a bit last meeting, which I was not a part of, but are we going to get a more detailed picture of iReady results school by school?
We did a presentation, and at the end of the year, you'll be getting the end of the year results. So schools set their goals at the beginning of the year. So they did a progress monitoring. I'm losing track of time. I think in March, so last month. And so that all the principals, well, they put it in the report. They were going to do a presentation, then we decided not to do that. After the end of the year iReady, then at the retreat, when they're setting their goals for next year, then you'll hear the progress toward the goals. They're how they did in achieving their goals this year, and you'll hear what their goals are for next year. So
Okay.
We're giving it the full calendar year. What I can say to you, because this has been part of our needs assessment, we've been doing a pretty high level of analysis of iReady performance and growth as compared to NWEA performance and growth, recognizing that they are different measures, but they're also both nationally normed and they're highly valid and reliable tests. There's actually quite a strong similarity in performance for proficiency levels, for meeting standards, as well as growth patterns from NWEA data and iReady data this year, which is interesting to be really considering this year for us. That I'm considering it. It's kind of obsessively on my mind right now.
Thank you. So that will be, I'm sorry, so we'll get, that we reported out, was that in the fall?
Yeah, it will either, we have to figure out whether we're going to try to do it at the retreat or whether it will happen like September, October. So we'll fine tune the timing of that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other comments or questions? following up on David's, what happens if you get, or a principal gets a call from a parent, let's say next fall, saying, I'm not sure I want my child going back to school because I don't know whether there are unvaccinated staff who might be carrying this thing that will give it to him, and then my child will infect my mother or my father or whatever it is. How can we respond to things like that?
Well, the response that I have been given when that question has come to me, which it has, is that right now we don't have any information. We don't know what the state is going to require or not. We don't know what kind of guidance they're going to give us. And I anticipate that that will be something that the Department of Health will be considering with the Agency of Ed over the summer. But we, people are protected about their vaccine status as adults. So it's not something that I can be asking our employees absent any type of statute or requirement, legal requirement. So for now, we're holding off and expecting information.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions about the superintendent's report?
Ben has his hand up. Herb.
Oh, Ben, sorry.
Here. Yeah, thanks. And I'll just put my hand down there. Thank you for sharing this. And I love the acronym, sort of the reframing of and using the acronym of resetting. And I'm curious about the composition of the team and whether, especially in keeping with this, relationships and equity sort of being right at the top, if that group is doing anything different in their needs assessment to try to really understand the complexity of the equity issues that have come up right now, and maybe in a different way than might have happened in the past or anything. I'm just sort of curious about that process and that group.
Sure. So the agency gave us some guidelines for membership. So we tried to work within that. They also were very much encouraging us to keep numbers small. We were going to go larger, and then we pulled back so that we had a smaller group of people. We have one of the people that we included was a teacher that was not on the original list, but we felt like that was important. I'm going to probably mess this up, Skylar, as I try to think about team members. We've got a teacher, we have a nurse, we have a principal, we have a director of student services, Skylar, myself, we have Marianne Morris from the collaborative, and who else am I missing? I just blanking.
Student service director.
Right, we have a student service coordinator and a student service director. That might be it. I can't remember. So we've got the team. I will tell you that the first meeting was to try to really look at any data source that we could find. So we've been continuing to collect data. Part of what we're looking at as in response to the equity question is around disproportionality. What we know is that we continue to have our data is disproportionate. We have performance gaps with our students who qualify for free and reduced lunch and the overall general population. We have gaps with students with disabilities and our overall population. We have disproportionate behavioral data for boys over girls. So we know that we've got all those data points. They are not a result of the pandemic. They are longitudinal within our system. So we know we've got student engagement challenges. We collected attendance and engagement, truancy, and we don't have, I shared this with you, I believe at the last meeting, we don't have very high numbers. And I think there could probably be an argument made that these students were disengaged last year as well. That it looked different because the situation was different, but we have engagement issues that we'd like to tackle and try to create a more engaging experience for students who are pretty disconnected from our system. So I don't know if that is the type of response you're looking at. There is a whole lot for us to be considering right now. And we're looking at as a system. Schools are also looking at all of this at their building levels.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I don't, and I, again, like, we're operating at the policy level, so I don't want to try to, probe too far into this, but it's thinking about our equity framing and how you're framing this with equity, and just sort of curious about how that's looking and shaping up. So I appreciate that, and be curious to hear how, like student voice and parent voices get into that conversation too. So I'm sure they are. But.
Yeah, no, we are very much talking about that exact topic right now, and how do we collect information in an inclusive way that doesn't further marginalize or tokenize people. And so we are, as an administrative team, talking through this right now. There are a number of us who are reading a book about belonging by Crabapple, and is that Crownapple? Crownapple, is that his name? John Crownapple, right? Is that his name?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And there's a great set of survey questions in there that I'm really eager to collect information about. So there's a lot of attention going to this work, and we're going to see where it goes.
Any other
Thanks.
comments or questions? I have a technical one down at the
John has
bottom
his hand up.
of packet page 15. Is language about additional leave, and it says the BRSU will provide additional leave. I'm assuming that the T&G would be doing the same thing, right?
Yes, I was referring the whole system, not the district. So it's for all of our districts. So when it applies to everyone, I tend to just use that. So yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't just restricted to BRSU employees.
No.
Okay. Anybody else?
John has his hand up.
John.
Randy, we lost a number of students to, not that we lost them, but a number of students went to home study in the past year. I can't remember how many, if maybe you can recall off the top of your head how many students that was. And I guess kind of a two-part question. If you remember how many there were, do you have a sense of, if many of the students will be coming back? Are there, do they feel uncomfortable to come back? And maybe for Sue too, are there fiscal implications to, I know this year we were held harmless, but are there fiscal implications down the road of losing, number of students to home study because of the pandemic?
Sure. So we don't know the answer to that yet, but it's definitely possible about the financial implication. If our ADM goes way down and there's no reprieve for that, then it would likely have an impact. I have not sent a survey out about home study families yet. I think, Celeste, I don't know if you know this number off the top of your head. We're T&G at about 100. Is that right? Well, if you know that.
I could find out the actual number of total T&G home study kids, but are you just talking like K through 8 for this year?
Well, I would say K through 12, because the question John asked is related to the financial impact.
Okay, I can get you to it in 2 seconds.
Okay, thank you. It fluctuates a lot, and so I don't tend to look at it. I look at school by school when I do look at it.
Thinking maybe 100 loss or total?
Total, yeah, 100 total, which is not. It might be. I think we were like between 60 and 70 in other years. So the other piece, just I'll add to this because I know that you'd asked about this a few months ago, and I had said that I was exploring it. I haven't done anything with it yet. Skylar and Laura and I are having a meeting, but I did send a survey out to all students who would be attending, to the families of who have children who would be attending our schools, but instead selected to attend an independent school. So I sent a survey out to ask those families to share with me, a lot of information. Why did they do this? What were some of the reasons? Would they return if they had the opportunity? So that we could use that information to have a sense of what was going on with those families who left, and to use to inform our work. We've had, unfortunately, in the last I think 2 or 3 weeks, the meeting's been bumped for a couple of twice for 2 unexpected things that arose, but we will have that meeting in the near future and use that to inform our work. So I do plan on sending something out to home study families. I just was waiting until May to do that. I didn't want to do it. I felt like I'd have more accurate information a little bit closer to the end of the school year. My hope was, I didn't really think that doing it in the midst of high levels of COVID was necessarily going to be useful for me. But we'll have to look at that.
And just one more quick follow-up. I don't know if it's possible, but is it possible or even legal if a student were not to be assigned to a specific school, maybe, would T&G be allowed to provide remote programming for all students within the district, hybrid home study maybe? Just thinking if students are not comfortable coming to school, is that a possibility that there could be full remote, like a regionalized remote offering?
Yeah, are you referring to next school year?
Yeah.
At this point, I am not on my own wanting to offer a remote option for our families. Whether or not there might be some sort of regional option, I don't think is totally off the table. But I think for a K-8 system, having our kids back in school is important. One of the, I'm trying to think about, this came from one of our instructional coaches who was sharing with me, hey, we know that there are some students who are thriving under a fully remote option right now. We have a number of students who are doing incredibly well. And so the question was raised about, it would be really good for this student to continue that. And my response was, just like I said to you, I don't have any intention of offering a remote option, but from my perspective, those are opportunities we should be capitalizing on. I would want to see that parent and teacher and student sit down and develop a PLP that is harnessing, their strengths and their learning and their skill development, and to create whatever the program is that particular student or any student, create a program that really meets their needs, that solicits high level of engagement, that builds on strengths and skills. And I want our system to be flexible and able to engage in innovative practices that are not traditional by nature. So, even in that case, my response to folks who are concerned about coming back to school for health reasons, I would say, let's have a meeting. Let's talk about what may be possible. How might we meet your child's needs in a way that also meets, whatever those factors are? And we may not be able to meet all of them. We may not, but I don't want us being so black and white that we close the door. I think we've learned a lot about what's possible this year, and I don't want to lose that.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Mel, I think your hand was up a while ago. Did you have a question? No? Anybody else have any questions or comments about the superintendent's report and the reset versus restore? By the way, question for you, Randy. Is part of the thinking there that what we're hoping to have happen in the fall isn't actually 100% restoring what was before, that there will be some differences, so reset's more appropriate anyway?
Well, yeah, the word that the state's using is recovery.
That's right.
And that's the word that we were struggling with. And so reset, you can, what that word means. And it does, I think it's filled with opportunity and possibility. So that's, and I would like it to not be exactly what it was before. We owe it to our children and our families for it not to be exactly what it was before.
Anybody else? All righty. Next item is the Floodbrook School Principal update.
Yeah, so we pulled this out in the agenda just to give some space if people wanted to talk about it. I did put information in my report, so you do have some details. We are bringing Amy Harlow on, and I have here on my computer exactly her role because their school is such a long name. So, she is currently the principal at the Washington Village campus of the Echo Valley Community School District up in Washington, Vermont. But she is local. She is local to this area. She lived and worked over in Rockingham and for many years and continues to have a house there. So was up as a principal for the last 5 years and is coming down here. She really, she is a solid leader, a solid experienced leader. I think that, the information that she provided, the references, how she interviewed with us hit so many of the characteristics and skills and traits that the Floodbrook staff and families were looking for. I feel very positively about her joining. She is coming to meet with staff tomorrow. She and Jackie have been in communication very regularly. She's going to start connecting with the school and staff. And as we look at the work in Floodbrook for the next couple of months, we're kind of finding that path forward for the work that Jackie's doing in order to set things up for Amy when she joins our team here. So I feel good that the committee, the process was comprehensive, thoughtful. People spent a lot of time making this important decision and showed a real commitment to the process. So that's it.
Any questions or comments about the new Floodbrook? Jim?
Just curious, June 30 start or?
July 1st, yes.
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments? The next item then is the governance process. And the first item there is to review the plan for policy monitoring, which is on page 18. It's also mirrored in the work plan.
Okay, if I can,
Yeah.
the policy committee now can only meet, or any committee can only meet if there's more than one board member absent a warned meeting. A lot of discussion took place before we understood that kind of discussion. And what the committee is Mel and Deb and Jane, and obviously Randy also attended, actually went through, mostly led by Deb, who really looked through the policies and tried to come up with a timing of those policies for review. We as a board are supposed to, on an annual basis, review all of 3-point, et cetera, and 4-point, et cetera, and do it in a timely manner. And so the proposal, which the policy committee reviewed last Friday, again, has a pretty good order. Some of the meetings where these policies, which is on packet page 18, may take us a while to work through. But the idea is that the policy will be presented in the packet leading up to the meeting. Secondly, we're asking each board member to do what Randy and Jackie did, which was to propose in their own minds and then share with the rest of the board exactly what that policy means, and then methodologies to suggest how we can comply and what kinds of evidence we would need. Because 3 and 4 have all sorts of things in it, it's a little hard to kind of come up with a specific organization. But the idea, which was shared with David and Herb, the idea is for us as a board to essentially, in public, go through the same process that effectively we just did with 2.6, and that we ask every board member independently to look at the policy, think about methodologies for compliance and things that might be necessary if somehow the board is out of compliance with its own policies. And then over the years, we would also want to suggest wording that either would drill down or clarify or expand upon the particular policy. And so that is our proposal to the board as a methodology. If you look at 3.0, 3.1, and 3.2, fortunately, our first go at this should be relatively straightforward.
Mhm. Can I add to that?
Yeah,
Dick?
go ahead.
Please.
We also think that since this is we're setting up a routine to do this every year, that this year we'll focus mostly on the two things that Randy has done. We'll sort of identify what the interpretation of the policy, what does it mean, and what kind of evidence do we need to know whether or not we're complying with it. We'll compile that information, and we'll do that for each policy as we go through the year. Then next year we will use those guidelines to actually review the policies. So this year we won't be looking at unity of control or whatever and saying, are we doing it? This year we're just laying the ground rules. And we'll do that every meeting for all of those policies.
And I would add one further comment, and that is that this 3.0 to 4, et cetera, is independent of the other job which we are engaged in, which is the finalization eventually, soon, I hope, of the ends policy.
Right.
This is not part of that procedure. No. And we as a committee said an ends policy that is well written probably in most years does not need to be revised unless the evidence clearly indicates that we have failed to do the appropriate thinking about an appropriate ends. And the reason for that is that the ends policy is supposed to be a long-term framework which guides the principals and the superintendent with respect to actually coming up with the ways of getting to those ends.
Right.
Thank you.
So
Either
we'll
Jane
just-
or Randy, would you like to add anything? I think you're the other members of the committee, right?
Yeah.
All right.
I was just going to say, we'll compile each meeting, we will compile a little, our rule book for doing this. And then next, I will present it to you to make sure that it accurately reflects what you said last week or last month. And then next year we'll use it.
Yeah, I think that was all well stated. I guess I would offer to the board or ask, should there and would it be easier to create a Google form for people to fill out ahead of time so that we had that information, maybe written. We know this will be somewhat challenging because we're going to have to, 1, discuss ideas, and 2, come to some kind of final conclusion all at the same time. And I think everyone, Dick, I'm reading your name, Dick, Jane, and Deb would all agree, like if this isn't working and it becomes kind of cumbersome, we can reevaluate it, but this seems like the best approach to start with anyway, and see if we can, if this can work, great, and we can go through the work plan.
Good idea.
Deb, you're just saying yes.
Oh, I
okay.
say that's a good idea, because if we have a chance to think about it before the meetings, we don't have to spend that time in the meeting.
So are the two things that you're looking for input on here are the chunks of work reasonable, and is the sequence the right sequence?
The board, since we've really gone through each one, we would suggest that the board adopt this and revisit it as we go through the process. We really have focused on issues of timing.
Mhm. There's
It's
a
the
little bit of-
process.
There's a little bit of fudging room because there's 1 month that's not accounted for. So if sometime we find we just can't possibly do it today, we can let it slip once.
Any comments or questions on that? Okay,
We have a question, Jeff.
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, hi. I'm just wondering, that sounds great, but is there any guidance we can receive from Val possibly relative to any models that one can use or examples to give us a little head start on this, as opposed to reinventing the wheel?
Because the policies are largely derived and put together both by our board, considering the examples that Val put together, and the language with respect to board responsibility is really how each board member, and then we as collective board members, choose to interpret the policies. And you can read the several things that Val has presented, but I think it's the thinking now is really on us. And if there are words in a particular policy that just strike you as an individual, all 15 of us in this process, as either unclear or needing some kind of modification, much as we just did in 2.6, then that needs to surface and be on the table. And it's we together as a board that accomplish this particular process.
Mel?
And the
sorry.
kind of model for it is actually what we just did with 2.6.
Mel, go ahead.
I just want to make sure that I have this part of the process correct also, in saying that we would have these conversations, we would come to hopefully some kind of conclusion, write it, bring it back to the board at the next meeting to then, as the final draft to then be adopted or in whatever order that needs to happen. But I don't think we would be, I don't think it'd be realistic to have a final crafted statement that we're going to approve that day. It'll be a combination of what we collect, how the discussion goes, and then probably have to meet as the policy committee, make sure we agree that, all points were responded to and addressed, and then bring it back a next round to the board to approve before we move on.
I see several folks nodding their agreement. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yep, good.
Okay. Anything else on that topic? All right. And then there's just two distribution items. You got the financial management questionnaire and the work plan, which also repeats the dates that you just found on back at page 18. Any questions about either of those?
I would say that this gets submitted to every one of the boards and is the annual affirmation that we have one of the best treasurers in the state, because she makes sure that we actually comply with absolutely everything that we're supposed to do. And if you read it, you'll recognize that we'll probably lose her to the state.
No.
Because she's terrific. And so
Thank you, Dick, but never.
traditionally, we just simply look at it, recognize how outstanding she is, and what a great position we are as a board.
Just a technical item. I think Sue's actually the business manager, not the treasurer.
Okay. Okay.
Treasurer is sort of a quasi honorific, I believe, isn't it? Just
it is, but
yeah. Okay.
Dick meant to say that she was treasured. That's what he was saying.
Thank you, Mel. Good correction, as always.
Anybody else want to talk to either of those items? None. All right, community engagement. And I will call first on Jane because I know she has a concern that I share.
So first of all, I don't want to be a spoiler here because I'm definitely in support of community engagement, and I'm glad to know that the principals are here too. But you know, one of the concerns I've had all along is just really appreciating integrity of data. And, you know, I think that also parallels then in making sure we get equitable response as well as what we do with that data. And, you know, with that said, I was a little surprised that, I mean, I knew that in the minutes, we all agreed upon what was in the minutes with that the Community Engagement Committee was going to present data and analyze. So I was surprised to come back into this meeting and look on the agenda to see that we've been given an assignment. I felt like the board did not vote on that. And so I just have to ask the question now. I mean, again, it's not that I want to be in opposition to supporting community engagement, but I am concerned about, with respect to policy governance and how a committee is charged and what the board is charged with doing, and not deferring to a committee, that we clarify, that we be sure about clarifying that role and scope. And, you know, I know that I've shared concerns before, and I think that, I think David had spoken to my concern before about the fact that, you know, that this has been long overdue as far as getting a survey, and that I know everybody worked really hard at getting a survey complete, but I still question the methodology and what's drawn from that. And I just have to add, because I know you guys don't know all my background or whatever, but I did graduate from a historically Black college and university. And I've had substantial experience in the past in working with racism issues. So I just want to share that concern about the quality of data and the process and the sampling. Thanks.
Anybody else have any, or would the committee like to present something first and then we can have more general discussion? John?
Yeah, speak to that point. I don't know if I'm allowed to share my screen here to show. This was going back to last fall, document I believe we adopted, entitled "For Board and Public Documentation Purposes," and it speaks to some of the goals of the Community Engagement Committee. Can I share my screen to show you some of that?
Celeste, is screen sharing enabled for participants?
Let me check. Hold on.
While we work to that, can I just speak just briefly
Sure.
to Jane's comment? And just to clarify for the board, Herb, you would ask something similar, I feel like, in an email. And I just want to make sure it's understood that this exercise that we were talking about today really is not designed to craft the final ends policies. It is not an opportunity, or we're not looking at it as, let's take this information and then go back and draft an ends policy. This was really specifically designed to help the board engage with the information we got, because there was just so much. And we thought it would be helpful to just, you know, to make sure that the board had a full perspective of the amount of information we got, and just get some key feedback before we started doing anything with it, as far as just checking data points. And that's kind of what we were hoping, is because I think it is so big. And before we break it down, I feel like we needed guidance as a committee as to how we felt we should start to formulate that breakdown. I know I personally was feeling like there was just too many data points and too many buckets to put things in, that without the board having a conversation about what they wanted back from the policy, or from the what committee is this? The Community Engagement Committee. We didn't really know exactly what to present to you. So that was the intention of this.
And if I could, yeah, I think I can share my screen now. And I believe this was adopted in the fall. Correct me, I'm a little fuzzy. But we, I believe we brought this document for you, kind of what outlining our why we're doing this, starting with why, and then the how, and this kind of detailed our charge. And I think what we were thinking was this phase 2 area, categorize the findings based on trends and common responses, analyze responses against demographic info, which we have not done yet, and distill the responses into a limited menu of purposes. Now, we haven't achieved all those, but I think I don't want to speak for the whole community engagement committee, but I think that was kind of our direction, is to start to that was our charge, if I remember correctly, and I think that's what we adopted as a board.
Jane and then Deb.
So I think this was really, John, I appreciate you going back and reflecting on that. And I just want to speak or reinforce the points that you pointed out, which are that we don't have the demographic information. And that actually, when we start looking at even the policy that I think was going to be discussed tonight about equity, if you look at the C29, even though we don't have privy to that in our packet, but it is on the VSBA website, it does talk about how there's going to be a need for indicators, or it recommends that policy envelop indicators that reflect demographic information, because that's the basis of how you form an equitable response. I don't question the fact that we're all well-intended at all, and that we're all doing our best. But I think it's really important on how you handle data and making something valid, and making something generalized. And so I don't want to lose sight of that.
Yeah, that's
Deb?
That's good. Yeah, we did spend about half an hour wrestling with this idea at our meeting, and a couple of us, or John, I think, and somebody else, had run the results through a program to see the frequency of certain words, and we saw that respect came up so many times in another word, and we found that really that wasn't it was good information, but not to our needs. I mean, what we thought we needed to gather from this was just a sort of a broad and general idea of what the community values. What do they want from our schools, and when we craft our ends policy, it ends up being one sentence or two sentences. We're never going to return to the people and say 300 people said they wanted this and 200 people said they wanted that. For one thing, we thought that would be really time consuming, but also it doesn't really serve our needs. It's not what we're looking for, we thought, in this endeavor. Mostly we're just wanting to hear from partly giving the community the opportunity to tell us what they want in itself, and then listening to them.
Lee?
Let me make sure okay, I am unmuted. I want to make sure that we sort of have an idea of what we're talking about here. There's quantitative research and there's qualitative research. This is qualitative research. You're not going to categorize this. You're not going to numericize it. You are not looking for a balanced random sample where you can come to some statistical conclusion. This is, what are the issues? What do we need to follow up on? And what do we need to do more research on, maybe quantitatively? But right now, this is idea generation, it's concept generation, and that can only come from the people we're serving. So I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this is more hypothesis generating than hypothesis testing.
Jane.
So I can appreciate, Lee, what you're pointing out, and I have done research too. And, so again, I just want to state that, I just was growing concern perhaps about the amount of time and what we might be reading or drawing conclusions with the data. That's what I'm saying, because I have to say, even my husband, when he was looking at the survey, he goes, we were joking, and he goes, he appreciated this, but he goes, gee, how I want to answer this is I want to answer it that I want my child to have the education that allows them to answer these two questions because of the fact it's an essay. If you really give it thought, and I just have to say that really when you deal with people of disparaging groups and lesser education, that will become a limited response to usually ask those kinds of questions like that. I understand the intent, and so please don't take me as a spoiler, but I just want to say I'm looking forward to hearing more about down the road or understanding that this data is limited at this point.
I just want to bring up a very narrow concern, which is judging from the minutes that we adopted, the board as a whole didn't decide how we were going to begin evaluating the responses. And I guess the most narrow question simply is, are we going to vote to do what the committee asked us to do? Jane?
Well, and I have to say, when I was thinking about this was the other concern I had. I mean, I'm a newbie, and I'm still understanding how the school board runs on policy governance. But I have to say, when I think about committees and what I'm reading in the books, I just felt like we didn't, as a board, did not vote on this process this evening. And again, that's not to say it's a spoiler, but I am concerned about making sure that we keep in mind how committees are used.
Dick?
Two things. First, I think that we were asked way back, and it's back in March, that the results became available. And Randy said, I'd like to share all of the results with you. And I think we'll do it in a Google document. And I think we'll ask every board member to go through, which, because I'm I guess a good student who does exactly what the teacher says, except when I object, and then I don't. So I read the every single comment, and then created my own series of responses. For example, the word kindness appeared in my estimate. I may have missed a few. I may have overestimated the word kindness. To me, as I have expressed, kindness is not something that the schools can do anything more than reprimand when you are not kind, but it is a parental responsibility. Whereas modeling respect for the individual and doing things like expressing respect by trying to treat everybody and their ideas as having worth is something. And if you actually look at the placeholder with respect to some of those sorts of issues, and I use the placeholder policy to try and measure where the responses were coming from. So it seems to me that if we're talking about qualitative research, the board needs to understand, in the limited number of people that actually responded, where the community seems to be coming from. Now, I also interviewed, as did Deb, before we ever sent the survey out. I think I talked in Londonderry to almost 50 people, either in small groups or other groups, and got many of the same things that this particular sample deals with. The fact is that we got more than 600 responses out of the community. And to me, having taught statistics, if you get 600 responses, that's a significantly large sample Now, that does not mean it is not biased, because people chose to answer it. And it's our job as a board to take and understand those who chose to respond, both informally and formally, and distill what that means. And so the questions that the committee asked us to do, which was very nice, because then I wouldn't have had to read more than a quarter of it, but I read them all. And the sample that we came up with, I grouped them, looked at them, tried to measure them against the whole routine. So I think that the process that the committee has engaged in, that basically we were asked to do back in March or late February when this whole thing was coming out, the board should read it. The board should understand it. And I think that's what we're about tonight. And I think it's particularly important that the critical piece that they asked, tell us the number of comment that particularly resonated with you, and the number of comment that, in other words, I said that the one that most appealed to me in the 500s was 577. I also appreciated the 85-year-old person who wrote a brilliant, really aged perspective comment. I've communicated all 6 of the ones that I identified. I thought tonight we were going to discuss some of the ideas that individually appealed to us. And we specifically asked that the current policy be included so that we could see just maybe how much of that policy is actually incorporated what the community seems to be interested in. So I think that the process should go forward. And if it requires a vote for it to go forward, I would make that motion, but I don't think it does.
I have to disagree with you on one very limited thing, Dick. I don't think under policy governance, a committee can ever tell a board of which the committee is a part what the board has to do. So I think a vote would be necessary.
Okay, I move that we accept the committee's recommendation that they wrote to us last Friday.
Moved by Dick. Is there a second? Seconded by David. I assume it was a second. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And the goal then would be to have done what the committee asked us to do, at least by the next meeting. Is that right?
The goal would be, if we actually did it, to begin the discussion and then move forward.
Mm-hmm. Any discussion on the motion?
Can
John?
I ask a process question here? I thought we already kind of agreed to this farther back in the fall, and I guess my understanding was that it's to the discretion of the chair, Herb. Is this, this is ultimately you decide what goes on the board agenda. Would this not be my understanding that this is, hey, this is our plan, here you go, and you can nix it or not. And I think, not to get off, I know we're talking about the motion, but I think, the process, maybe we should clearly define the process moving forward. And part of that process, to Jane's point, and I think with it, we're limited to how scientific we can be, but with any scientific or academic study, you're going to have a section and whatever's published about limitations. And we clearly need to identify what those limitations are, whether they're confirmation bias or, the problem with our sampling, to be mindful of those. And so, process, I guess, I don't want to speak for the committee, but it seems important that we need to find out what our charge is moving forward then, because we were discussing the possibility of having us all put these into buckets. There's only so much we can do with quantitative data, but we can put them into buckets and start to, or with qualitative data, we can put them in the buckets, then start to quantify the prevalence based on that. So that the goal tonight for the committee was really just to have you start engaging in what people said and then reflect on that. But I guess my first question is this the charge of the chair? Is this something that needs to be voted on?
I don't think the chair has any particular authority about that. Melanie.
So can I guess I would like to ask the board if, the next charge, going by the sheet that John pulled up, was for us to put these things into buckets to categorize. I believe that's like the first point. And that is where that's where we stopped, because we thought there was so much information that we were such a small sampling that we didn't feel comfortable defining those buckets without getting feedback from the board. So my question to the board would be then, would you prefer us, should we define our charge as to go put these into buckets and then come back with a discussion based on what we decided were the buckets? Or conversely, would you like to vote to next time as a full board discuss defining those buckets? Does the board want to be involved in that process outside the committee, or should the committee hold that responsibility first to define those buckets and bring it to you? And I think the buckets are very important before we start crafting policy, because we need to figure out, we want to break it down to a micro level so we can start thinking about these things individually instead of the whole.
A clarifying question for the committee was what you asked the board to do more along the lines of the first thing Melanie mentioned, or more along the lines of the second?
I thought they were the same. The idea to come up with, synthesize the work so that then we would take that back and try to put things into buckets.
Right.
So can I just add,
I'm sorry, Deb had her
No,
hand
I was
up.
just going to define buckets, so some people said tolerance of differences. Some people said respect people of different backgrounds. Someone said equity, those sort of hang together. They're different from critical thinking, sort of out of all the different terms that people use, some of them coalesce.
Randy?
I wanted to share with the board, having attended that meeting, right? I invited all the principals to this meeting, and I want you to, as a board, understand why I did that. When we had this meeting, well, I understand that right now we have a procedural issue that we're talking about. I want to put that to the side for a second, and I want to share with you what I experienced at that meeting as a superintendent and why I invited all of our leaders to join us tonight. That meeting started in a place that I think everyone's a little bit overwhelmed. Where do we start with this information? And it was a little bit bumpy at the start. We weren't getting very deep into the conversations. But as we started dialoguing about what people experienced when they read the responses, it started generating increasingly thoughtful and informative discussion. That discussion continued to evolve as we dug deeper and deeper into the concepts, into the patterns that we were seeing. And then it started generating some really insightful questions, which led to even greater discussion. As we worked through this and tried to figure out, how do we present this to the board? How do we work through this as a board in a way that is meaningful and useful? That's what generated the recommendation for you. The purpose of that recommendation was to provide you with a structure to engage in the exact type of meaningful discussion that the committee was able to have. And so you may agree or disagree with the fact that they made a recommendation. And again, I put that in procedure, but I want to make sure you as a board understand the intention. And I would look at the committee and ask, I think everyone had the same experience. I think it was a powerful conversation, and I wanted our leaders to hear you engage in the type of discussion that we had as a committee. So the reason that we did not predetermine the buckets was because that was part of the interesting conversation. And we were curious to see, would you as an overall board come up with some of the same things that we were discussing as a committee? And would you have some of those same aha moments that would then really guide your work moving forward that we had? So I want to share that with you because I don't want that to be lost on you. And I want you to hear where this committee was. And I truly wish you all could have been at that meeting. That's it. But I felt like it was important to not lose that.
Again, on the very narrow issue, what I received wasn't phrased as a recommendation. It was do this, do that. And that's where my objection comes, is that I don't think a committee can tell a board what to do. Jane, did you have your hand up?
And Randy, I hear you, and I'm really in empathy with what the committee has done. And I don't think that this is a bad discussion either that we're having. I mean, I think that this is good. I mean, because it's really getting at the heart, I think, of what equity is. And really the kind of mindfulness that it has to take on at some point. So the only thing I'll say is, I mean, and I'm glad to engage in, further discussion this evening or whatever, but I will say, I'm just concerned about having a lot of conversations that go into what this data means and what builds from this data. I think we really will have to, at some point, come to terms that it will have limits. And I know I've said that before, and I know last year when we first were talking about this and I was new to the board, I was surprised at one point. I think part of what I had heard the conversation come up about the community engagement was around building a school. And so I was concerned about, okay, what kind of data collection are we doing here? And what is this going to be used for? And so I was really concerned about the quality of data and what might be used for this and what, and the implications. Because if you do something like that, if you were looking at building a school from this kind of data, I think you'd really need to think about taxpayers' money and doing a formal needs assessment. And I know people assured me that that's not what was intended. I'm just saying that is what I heard as we went forward with community engagement. And then it stopped. And so I was glad to hear that. So I just would like to say, I'm glad about doing whatever tonight, but I think I know I'm going to be a little bit of a stickler like what Herb was saying, as far as I don't want to be told as a board what to do with this data, that we keep playing with this data. I'm a little concerned about that.
So Dick's motion is simply to make us agree that we're going to do what the committee wanted us to do. I don't hear the motion as saying this is the end of it all. I just hear the motion as being this is the next thing to do. Dave and then Mel.
Yes, I'm really frustrated with all this. We're spending a lot of time talking about process. You can talk about process forever. Perfection is the enemy of progress. If we're trying to make something perfect, we're not going anywhere. So I'm really frustrated with this. I think I want to applaud the committee for taking something that was really amorphous, a really difficult concept of community engagement and how do you get this thing going, and coming up with a format and a procedure. Yeah, it's not perfect, but it started the dialogue, and Randy spent some time explaining how inspiring that dialogue was. And now we're just talking about it and saying, no, let's just talk about having a dialogue instead of actually engaging. And so I'm a little frustrated with that, because you're not going to get a perfect starting point. But I do think that what we're forgetting in all this, and Dick mentioned it, that the response that we got was really quite profound. 600 people making the effort to engage. And we've been talking for years. How do we do community engagement? How do we get people started? We've tried to do this, we've tried to do that, doesn't work. Well, this worked. So holy mackerel, this worked. This is amazing. So let's look at it and see where it leads us. And yeah, we might make some mistakes. We might not get it right. But if we don't get started, we're not going anywhere. So I'm sorry if I sound obnoxious, but I'm really frustrated with just getting caught up in procedure without actually engaging.
Mel, then Ben.
Dave said everything I wanted to say. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'm right there too, and I feel like there's I'm sort of mulling on our board norms and procedure, and I feel like what we've actually just done is hijacked a process that was designed to equitably hear from the voices of the board, and we in committee created, picked a protocol designed by an organization that focuses on doing this exact kind of work in a way that we could talk in small groups and engage with this information and come to a deeper understanding of what we have. And part of that understanding might be, part of our conversation in that first group was like, wow, this is really, some of this data is really reflective of the exact time period where we asked these questions. And that was really important for us to grapple with as we filtered through that information and tried to make sense of it. There's a lot of things that we're going to get and we're not going to get out of qualitative data. We intentionally, as a board, did not choose to hire a professional organization or get professional training to do a survey and reach our entire audience. That was not the intent, and that's not what we have. And so I'm feeling, yes, you're hearing my frustration come out right now, because I feel like what we've done is actually hijack a process that was designed to hear from all our voices and hear from a few people and blow this whole thing up. So I'm feeling very frustrated with what are we trying to do as a board?
So bearing in mind that all Dick's motion is to get us to agree that we're going to do what the committee told us to do, is there any more discussion on the motion?
John?
Yeah, I just have one final point, and I still can share my screen, is that this is from the October agenda packet last October, and that spells out our process, and it's a question of process. I'm not going to belabor it, but it's a question of process. But I feel like we're falling within this process, and I'm with David on there as well. Our one of our norms is to proactively to have proactive community engagement, and I think we need to be aware of what let's be proactive.
Jim?
Yeah, I got seconding David's comments. I'm kind of excited by all of this information and we clearly took a choice of, you look at what the survey was, a couple of very simple questions, and we generated massive volumes of writing on it, which is pretty fabulous. So I had a good time going through it. And my one question to the committee members, though, along with Dick's motion, is, based upon what you heard tonight, I was a little bit surprised by the specific nature of those questions you were asking us to look at. And just based upon what you've heard tonight, do you think that would you change our homework assignment at all?
Lee?
I would argue that actually we should change the homework assignment, because we, at least as I followed the initial discussion, we were talking about, categorizing these into buckets, and that's appropriate for qualitative research. And we were asked what the one thing we saw was, and I don't think that's going to get us into buckets. And what the big buckets are and what the little buckets are and what the important things are. What themes did you see, or something along those lines would be more. I mean, I kind of did that in my Google document response, but I think maybe the homework assignment needs to be slightly rephrased, in my opinion.
Anybody on the committee want to explain why it's worded that way?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that, because we went back and forth whether to start with buckets or not. And I'm sorry, am I recognized, Herb? Am I good?
Yes.
All right, sorry. And again, it's like getting back to this part of engage full board with outreach and survey data collection. And this was our effort to engage the board, and then move on to that next step. We had a plan to go to buckets, but we said, let's engage in this first, let's give everyone an opportunity to make sure we all engage in it before we go on to this next step. So just a little bit more of a deliberate and intentional approach in that regard. But yeah, 6-1, half the dozen the other, I think.
Other folks want to comment? Again, we're still talking about Dick's motion. I don't see anybody else. Okay. All those in favor of Dick's motion, which is that we are going to do what the committee told us to do on back at page 26, correct, Dick? Yeah. Please raise your hand.
Can you restate the question, please?
Yeah, the motion was, if I have it, Dick can correct me. The motion, I believe, was that we as a board are going to do what back at page 26 asked us to do, which is to read the numbered responses. They were assigned to different board members in groups of 150 roughly, and then complete the Google form if we could, and answer questions A, B, and C.
Herb, before you, I'm sorry.
Dick, I just want to make sure that I've phrased the motion correctly.
Yeah, what the motion also suggested that if some of us actually did it, to begin the process of discussion tonight.
Okay. Would you mind separating it out, because I have a feeling some of us did and some of us didn't.
I'd be happy to separate it out.
So could we just vote on whether those of us who haven't already are going to do what's on page 26? And who was the second to the motion?
David.
I think it was David. David, is that okay with you? Okay. All right. Mel, do you want to speak to that motion?
Yeah, I do. I just want to say, and just remind everybody, there's an opportunity for an amendment to that motion now that it's been voted, that it's been put in play. So if anybody has a separate recommendation, I think we, make sure that we throw it out there and we entertain that as well.
Jane?
The only thing I wonder about now, with the sake of time and the fact that we do have other people in attendance from the community, if maybe the board might find it helpful to suspend this evening and hear from the community, their feedback or input thus far.
So is that a motion to postpone discussion of the current motion until we've heard from some designated people?
It sounds like a third motion, and I would say we have public comment too.
Yeah.
I would just say that the people who are here are not on the board. We're here to listen to the board's discussion, not necessarily they didn't come to contribute to the discussion. They came to hear yours.
So certainly they're perfectly welcome to and enter the discussion if they want to. Okay, I think we have a motion on the floor. I haven't heard any amendments. So those in favor, could you please raise your hand?
Is this Jane's motion or is this Dick's motion?
This is Dick's motion. Jane didn't make a motion.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, again, okay. Anybody opposed to the motion, please raise your hand. All right, that passes.
Without objection from the chair, I'd like, as one board member, for those of us who actually did prepare, to begin the discussion tonight, which will give us some sense of where it will continue in the next meeting.
I agree with you. Would it make any sense, though, to hear from Sam or Lexi or both of them about what they're up to before we get into the discussion of the data that we have? Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think the proposal was that we split that motion into two, and the second part B, do we talk about it tonight or not? And so I'm feeling if if we have the process that we designed was intended to happen in small groups so that we could engage in so each of us could have more voice and hear from one another in a smaller setting. And it doesn't make sense with the time that we have to do that unless we were to run far past our schedule. So just in terms of that work, I would say at this point we ought to postpone any conversation. And then if there's a desire to change some questions or add other thoughts that people have input, there's plenty of opportunity to do that.
What do folks think about that, Mel?
I'm sorry, I was maybe just a step back. I was just going to say, if we want to hear from Sam and Lexi, I think we should give them a heads up ahead of time so that because I know that they're in process with stuff. And not being on an agenda, I feel like we'd be just kind of calling them out.
They actually are on the agenda.
Oh, my bad. I missed that part.
And we did reach out to them ahead of
Okay, all right. I take it back.
Yeah. So would either of you, Sam or Lexi, like to say what you're thinking of and what's going on?
Sure. So when we first agreed to join the board, one of the things that you guys told us you wanted us to do was student outreach and focus on the kids and less of the adults. And so we have had a few meetings now talking about how we can do that and different ways we can do that. And so we have the idea for a Google form to send out to students who don't really want to talk, but we can get some quick information. We just met the other day to have some questions. Mel also suggested the use of a rubric to keep it less about teachers or anything like that. But we can add a rubric in the Google form. So we have some questions that are on a scale from 1 to 5. And then the other idea is to have focus group Zooms and have similar questions, but be able to actually talk to students and have conversations with them. And Lexi, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think just reiterating that even the open-ended questions, we made sure there was no way that they could target teachers, because that was one thing. And we also thought about what we personally as students would want adults to ask us, and that's how we formulated some of the questions. I don't know if now's the place or time. We did have a few other ideas that we can talk about at a later time or now to add into the survey, or whether or not they should be in the survey. But other than that, Sammy said it all really well.
And then the final thing is we're hoping to have a K through 4 section with questions, and then a 5 through 8. So it's easier and more direct for different age groups.
Would the board like to hear what Lexi was mentioning in the way of additional items? I think it might inform our own work on the other question there.
Yeah, so one of the things we were thinking about is that this is more centered toward the survey for the 5 through 8, as they could better gauge their own mental health. But thinking about mental health, as we know that's been a big discussion in schools, how are students' mental health? And so just asking questions we didn't really think about these. We want to know if those were questions that you guys would want to hear from students, is questions that are targeted towards how their mental health was this year. Was there any added stress that added to mental health problems or issues like that? Obviously not too personal or anything like that, just getting a gauge on how that has changed from past years. And then another thing we had an idea for is that if we did do Zoom meetings and it was decided that it was not possible to meet with a large range of multiple classes, that principals could decide that they wanted a targeted group of students, choosing a few students from kindergarten first, et cetera, going up and stuff like that, to have a targeted meeting. And those were the things that we were talking about. Sorry if I talk too fast.
No.
I can answer any questions.
And to add on to that, the reason that we started talking about asking questions about mental health, this so far, I'm looking at the list of questions we have, and I can share my screen if you want to see. But we were trying to ask kids about we want to see the difference between the online and remote learning. One of the rubric questions we have is how easy was it to pay attention? Because at least for me, I was just thinking about I would give myself a 3 for remote learning, and I pay attention when I'm in school because I have to. But the reason that we started talking about asking questions about mental health is because we were sent out a survey that was a rubric, like answering questions from a 1 to 5 scale by a voting student representative on the like the Vermont School Board, I believe.
Yeah, the Vermont Board of Education. She was a student representative for that.
Which I don't know about Lexi. I filled out and it was kind of cool, and I don't know if she's presented that yet or anything, but it felt nice just to be asked about those things. And it wasn't like super personal, but like it asked us how we coped with things, like how often do we go outside, and she worked with health professionals to create this survey, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, and to answer your question, I did also fill that out. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh,
Anybody
I
have
was just going,
questions?
sorry, I'm so sorry. Oh my.
That's okay. You know, it occurs to me that one of the things that our ends policy should give the superintendent some guidance on is includes how do you react to a pandemic? I don't mean specifically if confronted with a pandemic, do A, B, and C, but somewhere in the policy should be something that a superintendent can look at and say, okay, well, I think I have to consider the following things at figuring out how to react to this. Anybody have any questions for Sam or Lexi?
I just want to say thank you. Keep it up.
I'm thinking that given the time of day, we may want to move to the legislative and regulatory action and see if there's any questions about the very comprehensive thing that Jim distributed before we go back to community engagement. I believe also Jane had a motion she'd like to make relative to the student community engagement.
Thanks, Herb. Yes, I had mentioned that on the close of the Women's History Month, it seems befitting that for the board I would like to move that the board formally recognize the contribution of Sam and Lexi with respect to their recent support, also in working with student leaders at BBA regarding helping to make a positive demonstration in change in the rape and rape culture in our community.
Okay, motion by Jane. Is there a second? Is that a second, Mel?
Sure.
Okay. Any discussion? Mel?
Just that I will back that up and say I feel very lucky that we have 2 bright young women on the board and 2 students that, regardless of your gender, I really appreciate that you guys are being so thoughtful in approaching the work here on this board and doing your own work to engage the community outside of the board. It's awesome work. So thank you.
Any other discussion? Okay, all those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed, please raise your hand. Anybody abstaining, please raise your hand. Passes unanimously, and thank you very much. Is it all right if we proceed to the legislative and regulatory and then see if we have time to come back to community engagement?
I just want to acknowledge the time of the school leaders on the call.
I was going to say the same.
If we're going to push it off, then we're using more of their time tonight. I just want to acknowledge that. I'm not sure where that leaves us.
Good point.
We're having a lot of fun, I'm sure, but
I was going to actually make the suggestion. We had a motion that was split, and we never took up the second half, which was to decide whether we were going to talk tonight or not. And I would just like us to say that we're not going to talk about this tonight and apologize to the school leaders for asking you to come and not being able to get to that. And thank you for your time.
Okay. Yeah. Ben brings up the other half of the motion. I assume whoever seconded Dick's would agree that that's properly on the floor. Any discussion on the second half, which is
Actually, I never made the second motion. I asked the chair to rule in the capacity of being a chair. And it seems to me that the committee itself can publish the results that might have been submitted in Form 2 before the next meeting, and that might inform a little bit better our discussion.
all right. I don't think the chair can create a motion, so
No.
we don't. Apparently, we don't have one on the floor then. So the question then would be, and you can do it by nodding or whatever. Shall we continue discussion of community engagement at this meeting, or should we go to legislative? Bearing in mind the legislature usually tries to wind up sometime in April, early May.
But can we just maybe just decide on the process? You know, are we just going to table this, which is fine, but then can we maybe agree to, then we'll all work before our next meeting to start to, we'll give you a process to put these into buckets. Is that
I think that was in Dick's motion.
okay? So
No,
we have a motion on the floor right now. I'm a little confused. No, okay. So I move to table the community discussion, a community engagement discussion until next meeting. And in the meantime, the community engagement committee will provide a process for members to start to organize the responses into buckets.
Sounds good. Is there a second?
No.
Is there a second? Seconded by Dick. Okay. Discussion on the motion. Mel.
I thought Dick's motion was that we were going to follow through on the process that was already prescribed, and that that's what we're doing at the next meeting.
No. The chair has ruled that until John made a motion, there was no motion on the floor.
I'm sorry. I specifically,
now is John's motion.
Dick's original motion about following through with the process that we already prescribed. I thought we voted that we were going to, that everybody was going to fill out the sheet that we recommended for the next meeting. Not that we were going to come back with buckets, but that we were still going to follow through with tonight's original process, just next meeting when everybody.
Then you should vote against John's motion, I suppose.
No, I was applying that we do both. I'm sorry, that we were going to continue with this process, and also leading up the next time, we'll provide a separate opportunity for board members to start to identify different themes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's like a little bit more homework.
Can you authorize, yeah.
Excuse me, Deb. John, do you want to restate your motion?
Yeah, so I move to that we table community engagement discussion tonight, and that we continue the process at the defined process at our next meeting, with the addition of that in the meantime we start to identify themes, common themes in the responses.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there a second to John's motion? Seconded by Dick. All right. Any discussion? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Any opposed, please raise your hand.
No,
Anybody abstaining, please raise your hand.
no, and
Deb is abstaining, okay?
no, I'm not abstaining. I have a comment.
Okay. Is it about the motion?
Yes.
Okay, we've already voted on the motion, so I'm going to go
Okay.
on to the next agenda item.
I just want to be sure that we're authorized as a committee to meet and iron this out. I mean, this is an issue that we need to really spend some time on, and that we'll come up with the best plan that we can, but I want to be sure we're authorized to do that.
You're authorized to do what the motion said, but again, I repeat, and this is just my view as chair under policy governance, no committee can tell the board what to do, regardless of which committee it is and what it's saying.
Mhm.
Okay, we have quite a few packet pages from Jim. And again, bear in mind, the legislature tries to, excuse my cat here, tries to wind up in April or early May. Jim, do you want to highlight anything that you think we may wind up needing to take a stand on?
At this point, there are a heck of a lot of moving pieces. My real intent with this is to provide each of the boards, because actually providing it to Meadowy and Winhall as well, with just an overview of what's going on. Try to make it a little more local oriented than, the VSBA legislative blog is very good. Everybody should be signed up for that. But this is intended to bring it a little bit closer to home. I thought I'd try to avoid, going through each item or anything like that. Give it to you in advance. That's the whole idea. Provide it in advance. So mostly it can be a Q&A session. There are some things going up, S100, which is the universal meals. That actually, in the note, I mentioned that it, was sort of being put aside. It seems like that it's still not totally clear, but it looks like that may be totally put aside in that current form for this session. Just to kind of add a little bit to that, the universal meals idea, it would be wonderful to be able to do that, but it's a very expensive program that would cost 24 to 40 million. They wanted to put it through our individual school budgets at first. They got a lot of pushback on people saying that would push educational programs out of the way. And so then their next idea was to take it off the top of the ed fund, which then would create an increase in every district in the state's taxes of somewhere between 2.5 and 5 cents of each of our school districts. So it's, at this point that was sort of the biggest item, currently going on. And it seems to be a bit sidetracked. There's a lot of other stuff going on. The waiting study is very big. And pensions did become very big, but that seems to be being put off for a study committee. So with that's sort of the update on items in there. If people have questions, I'm happy to ask or try to answer them now, or absolutely feel free just to shoot me an email too if you want. I tend to be involved in a lot of this stuff.
School meals is on packet page 29. Dick?
One of the things that we did ask was to clarify the procedure and the difference between a board response, a joint board superintendent response, and lastly, an individual response, where we would potentially list the fact that we are what we are, and that is a board member. So is that something we do need to clarify, or is it clear enough?
I think, it's interesting on a lot of these issues. You can have one thing that I've learned is you can actually, as an individual voice or as a school board member or the school board, you can have a lot of impact in this tiny little state when you go out. And honestly, if 5 members of this board went out individually to our local legislators versus this board sending a letter, it would probably have more impact, but the board sending a letter as well is, can be a good idea. I think that is, and you raise a very good question though, Dick, because I've felt uncomfortable a few times, signing letters as chair without the board having totally approved it beforehand.
With respect to policy governance, it's important that if we do something as a board, that we absolutely get input with the practical effects on the superintendent, because when we take a position, for example, on universal meals, it has a profound effect on the capacity of the superintendent to be able to afford virtually anything else. And it's important that when we do something as a board, that the superintendent have an opportunity to weigh in. However, there are certain circumstances where it is important that we as a board take a stand. And because we only meet once a month, there needs to be some sort of fair mechanism other than the individual people writing that allows for the board to respond in a timely manner to something that is just going to affect our situation in a truly deleterious way.
I think that's a very good point. One of the ideas behind sending or putting this together before each set of meetings, and this my ideas that we have our next meetings in May. I'd put together a new note with where things stood and share it with you guys. And part of the reason is so that the board can be in a position to potentially respond quickly or understand. But that doesn't answer the question that you have, which, how can Herb as the TNG chair, me as a BRSU chair, how can we speak for the board without having discussed it at a board meeting? I don't know the answer to that.
Question, Jim, I realize universal meals may not go anywhere, but we don't know that yet. Is that if it does move forward in the legislature, is that the one thing that you can identify where we probably should be taking a stand, either as a board or individuals or both?
I think if that were to start moving forward again, then yes, I think it would be something that, again, it's not an easy issue because it'd be wonderful to be able to give all our kids free meals. But, the financial repercussions are pretty serious. Right now, they're talking about doing something scaled back. But if it came back full, the way it was written at first, then I would suggest, and I have discussed this with Randy as well. I think it's important that we would potentially weigh in on that with our local legislators.
So maybe we should hear a little bit from Randy on this. I guess if at least if I'm going to be asked to sign a letter on behalf of the board, I would appreciate a board vote that, at least in its current form, we do not approve this legislation.
Ben is desperate to speak.
I beg your pardon, who?
Ben.
Ben.
Yeah, I got to say, like, I've had my hand up since Jim first started talking and first mentioned the universal school meals, and we got to do a better job with this. I'm really, so I'll talk at the end when we talk about norms again.
I apologize.
My point to this is that I think there are a lot of reasons actually to support the universal school meals, and there are organizations in the state who are focused on the welfare of our kids and who have been very vocal in support of this bill, and they've got a lot of good reasons why. There are really good financial reasons why this represents some real issues, and I think we have both responsibilities as a board to think about the well-being of all of our children and to think about the financial responsibility that we're putting out there and what we hold. And I for one would want to have a lot more discussion about this before we came out as a board and in opposition of this bill. And I personally, at this point, I would be in favor of supporting this bill because I don't see finances and I don't see education as a zero-sum game. And I think that if we decide that we want to feed all of our children, because that is a precursor to learning, it's an essential component to being prepared and ready to learn, and it's not being provided in other ways in our state, then I think that's our responsibility. And I think we have to figure out how to do it. And that may mean asking more of our constituents. So it's a bigger discussion, and it's 8:30.
Before I call on Jim, Randy, is there anything you'd like to say about this?
Are you asking me about the concept in general about communication?
No, the specific legislation that's up there right now.
The universal school meal bill.
Yeah.
I think that it's important from my perspective that, I don't disagree with anything that Ben just said. I think that it's important that the legislature consider how to fund it, that be included in their discussion. And I think that there are ways, if they want to move forward with it, that they fund it. But I also think it's important to recognize that there are a lot of bills at play that have intersectionality. And I think I've shared that before. I don't know if it was a BRSU meeting, or frankly, I don't know what meeting it was at. But depending on how they're thinking about what they're going to be using in order to determine if we're looking at the changes in ed funding and the weighting study and the mechanisms there, if they're going to be relying on data points related to free and reduced lunch, then you need to understand that that weighting will be impacted because we won't have the information that we have. But if they're going to continue to use DCF, I mean, there's a lot of factors. And so I think that what I continually say is that you have to think about how all of these pieces are fitting together as you're considering these individual bills. And I will kind of keep coming back to that my concern is that we focus on one bill in isolation when there can be really incidental impacts that we're not considering. We've got census block changing in that, we've got weighting, and if we're changing the way we're doing meals, all of those can impact funding and money in and out. We need to be cautious and aware of that and raising those questions, which is something that I've done in the work that I've done.
Jim?
Because Randy's point is extremely good. And I don't think individual legislators tend to recognize those intersections. They're really important. To Ben's point, I just want to say that, on the universal, meals bill, basically, the VSBA, the VSA, the VPA all came out and said, we're not against the bill if you want to fund it out of the general fund, and promise to keep on doing that. If you decide this is an important thing, we're not against the idea of feeding kids. We're against the impact it would have on our budgets.
I would just add that I'm remembering this conversation. I was meeting with a group of legislators, and I asked them specifically whether there had been anybody or any group identified at whose primary role it was to look at how everything kind of might come together. And nobody was. They all were clear that nobody was taking on that role. And I said, well, I think it's a tough position to put all of us in when nobody's looking at the holistic impact of these proposed bills.
Other thoughts? I mean, as things stand now, I wouldn't feel comfortable signing a letter taking any position on school meals on behalf of the board, unless you want to give me some guidance.
And I honestly don't think that is going to come back at this point. The head of the Senate said, "Oh, maybe it will," but I think she's the only person who's saying it. So,
Mel, is your hand up, or you're just thinking? Okay.
It's like a pillow.
Any other discussion on this point? Anything else under legislative and regulatory?
John has his hand up.
I'm just saying it might be.
Just a pointer, John. Your image is really dark. If you put your hand up in front of your chest, I can't see it.
Oh, I had my my emoji hand up.
Oh,
yeah.
Which is against light background. Okay.
Even though session might be over by the time we meet next, maybe Brian Campion be willing to speak to us again and give us a legislative update. I know Jim does a great job synthesizing everything, but maybe Brian would appreciate hearing some from us directly. Given that's just we don't need to discuss that. Just maybe it'd be a good time to have it back.
Anything else on legislative or regulatory? Okay. The next item then would be future agenda items, and I have a question. The minutes that we just adopted from March under future agenda items says policy committee nominations. Is there something that we need to do about that?
That was referencing, I think it's supposed to be recommendations. So it was about what we just talked about under policy, the plan for policy monitoring. So it was about following the policy recommendations for future agenda items.
Okay, so it wasn't nominations, it was recommendations?
Correct.
Okay. Does anyone have a future agenda item? Bearing in mind, if you think of one later, you can always get in touch with me or Dick or David or Randy. Not seeing any hands. Okay. And we have our second public comment time. I don't know whether we have public on YouTube or any other means, but if you have a comment, I hope Celeste would be funneling it to us.
Celeste, do you have anything?
There's not.
No comments? Okay. Let's take a minute to reflect on the norms, which is what Dick read at the beginning. It's on packet page 2. Any comments on anything we may have forgotten to do that we're supposed to be doing? Ben.
Yeah, I just I guess I just wanted to sort of express frustration again with how tonight went. And I think there's and this may be something that there's just like, this is how this has to run, but I get frustrated with the rigidity of our procedures, that sometimes we lose out on humanity in the pursuit of practice, and sticking with a process that is really rigid. And I just would comment that Robert's rules and the structures that we follow are largely creations of white supremacy culture, and they're designed to hold power and to hold the status quo, and they're not really well suited to hearing from a diverse group of people. They're not really well suited to getting a broad range of ideas. They're pretty good at keeping people at bay, and I think that's we see that in community forums across the state and more broadly, where they're designed to have public accountability and public participation, and what they do is have accountability but not much participation. And I'm really feeling that tonight in the process that that we went through. And I think it's it's good learning for us. It's good learning for me to be reminded of some of these things, but boy, it's really frustrating. And I feel like we're missing out on opportunity because we're holding ourselves to a structure that maybe is outdated. And I don't, again, that's just a comment for now, and we can try to, if people are interested in exploring that further at some other time, I'd be happy to engage in that. But I don't want to have a long discussion necessarily. Just wanted to share that.
I have to add, though, that the state law requires us to use Robert's rules. Jane?
I understand.
And I just have to say, I actually share your concern, Ben. But I think the way that we might be interpreting process and what it does might be different. But I think you and I both share the same concerns. So I hope that there's not that divide, despite the fact that it's frustrating for both of us and that we're all feeling a little deflated. But I assure you, I have been a champion of working with disparate groups. And so I am not a stickler of just rules and whatever. I am concerned about equity and the process of equity. Thanks.
Any other comments on the norms? Okay. The next meeting then is May 11th. Again, it's virtual, and there's one more motion that could be made.
That's not the first Tuesday of the month, but it was on the initial packet. And I need to point that out, that it is in fact on that date, May 11th.
Thank you. Does it show up that way on the work plan too, I hope?
Yes, it does.
Good, okay.
So the answer is that it was an intentional postponement, that we just need to remind ourselves that it's the 11th, not the 4th or whatever the.
Yeah. Would you like to make a motion?
Adjourn, please.
Okay, motion to adjourn by Dick. Is there a second? Seconded by Mel. All in favor, please say, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed, please raise your hand. Anybody abstaining? Okay, thank you for the discussion, and we're adjourned.
Are we able to keep on the community outreach committee just to plan, or are we able to stay on the meetings just to talk about when we meet next or no?
I think as long as Celeste or somebody else who's a co-host lets you, absolutely.
Yeah, Celeste, do you want to just make me a host and stop recording and then?
Sure.
And I guess anybody